Hi, Mr. Johnson here, and today we are talking about the element of space. Space. Okay, not that kind of space, but space in an artwork. So, oh, shrink myself here a little bit. So let's watch this great video from Design Dojo about the element of space, and I'll talk a little bit about how it's used, and then we'll go on from there. So long.
The element of space is a bit tricky. When artists and designers talk about space, they might actually be talking about three distinctly different things. There's 3D space, positive and negative space, and white space. 3D space refers to the spatial reality of width, height, and depth, or XYZ.
Ooh, math.
To render a sense of 3D space on a flat 2D plane, artists make use of 1 or 2 point perspectives, where vanishing points create the illusion of Z-depth. But even without vanishing points, whenever objects are layered in front or behind each other, some sense of 3D depth in space is implied. Okay, deep thought. It's not possible to draw one thing on a page.
Why
You
not?
see, anything you draw is both adding a new shape onto the page and subtracting from the original white shape of the page itself. So you're really creating two shapes, one that's added and one that's being subtracted. Artists and designers have long made use of positive and negative space to provide a sense of cleverness.
Get that arrow.
Next, there is white space, or the spacing between objects. Such spacing of objects is a huge part of what we call composition.
Mhm.
A lot of space can add to the visual weight of an object. A little space can make objects feel crowded. Consistent spacing feels orderly, logical, and can provide a sense of calm. Random spacing can feel chaotic or playful. And so it is that space, the stuff you don't actually draw at all, can be a key element of art.
So they covered a lot of information very quickly, but their videos are really fantastic. So there's no way I'm not using them. But I want to talk about a couple of the key elements that they referenced here, and then we'll look at some artworks that use them, so you get a sense, right, of how these things are used in actual art pieces that have been made. So I have two definitions for you. They're really simple and straightforward. Hopefully they should make sense. The first is positive space. And when we talk about positive space in an artwork, that's the area taken up by objects. That's the space where stuff is. The negative space is that unused area around the objects. So in the drawing of this ram, I'm going to call it a ram. I'm not really up on my horned animals. So in this ram here, in the drawing on the left, the artist has emphasized the positive space because they've drawn in lots of details into the creature, right? So the positive space here becomes the animal and the ground because that's where the stuff is. And the white space around it, the blank background, that's negative space. It's the unused area around it. Does that make sense? I'm assuming you're all saying yes. I don't know. In the second image, what the artist has done is focused on the negative space because here the subject has become just a blank silhouette. So because there are no details in that rendition of the ram and the negative space is filled in black, it really draws your eye to the shape made by the negative space. Right? So in the first one, because there are lots of details there, your eye gets drawn to the positive space. But here, in the second one, your eye gets drawn to the negative space. It's kind of a lofty concept, but I hope that that makes sense. If it doesn't, ask me about it, and we'll talk more, and I'll show you some more examples. So here's a student drawing of a lovely desk chair, not unlike the one that I am currently sitting in. You can't see it. I don't know why I turned. So in the first drawing, all the way on the left, this is a drawing of the chair. And they've included some sewn details in the fabric and the little headrest, and they've shaded in the arms and the bottom piece here with the wheels. So now what they've done, right, they've drawn the chair, and then they've done two drawings. The first one in the center highlights the positive space by shading in that silhouette of positive space all black. So this drawing is all about the positive space. And in the final drawing, the artist has shaded in the negative space, and they've left the area of the object blank. Make sense? Awesome. Then the other ways that you can use space, which they talked about in the video, are a sense of three-dimensionality, right? Space can be having length, width, and depth. So in the drawing of the chair, for example, the artist is showing the idea of space by having these parts of it overlap. So because this arm, the one that's closest to us, overlaps the side of the chair, and the back arm, we can't see this side, right? It's the chair overlaps it. It creates the illusion that this arm is closer to us and this arm is farther away. It's creating space right this way in these dimensions. And then the final way to use space is that white space on the page. And here these three chairs are shown almost in a little bit of a triangle composition. They're not quite in a row. The center one is raised up. And there's not a lot of white space around them. They're pretty close together. So let's talk about a couple of famous artworks and how they use space. So this is a painting called Sunflowers by Vincent Van Gogh, and it uses space in a really interesting way. So here you have the vase of sunflowers and the table on the bottom. That becomes the positive space, right? And then this light blue or blue-green shape in the back, this wall, whatever this is, that becomes the negative space because it's all about this area in between and around the flowers. So he's painted it, right? It's not blank, but that background area, that light blue wall becomes the negative space, and the vase of flowers becomes the positive space. Hopefully that makes sense to you. And then the way that he's used space in the vase of flowers itself is very interesting because they're really crowded, very tightly overlapped. In this painting, there are so many this whole bottom mass, right? They're all overlapping each other, and even the ones up here. So he's crowded them really tightly into that vase, and yet the vase is empty. Not empty. The table is empty except for the vase. So there's a lot of space around it. So I find that really interesting about this painting. I love it. It's on one of the cabinet doors in my classroom. So let's talk about this image of Spider-Man drawn by artist Mark Begley for the Spider-Man Life Story book. And what I love about the space here is that the red of Spider-Man's mask bleeds into the background. There's really no break here between the positive space of Spider-Man's head and neck and shoulders and then this red part of the background. I think it's such a cool way to create this illusion because we know that Spider-Man's head stops. We know it doesn't keep going, but the space there kind of bleeds together. It's very ambiguous space. I think that's really cool in an illustration. Then we obviously have the blue space on the right is negative space. That's very clear. The face is the positive space. The blue is the negative space. But then this red is kind of both because there's nothing here, but it also becomes his head and neck. It's so cool. I love this illustration. I think his use of space is amazing. He's also a fantastic illustrator. He's done a lot of Spidey comics. So if you like Spidey, check out some of the work by Mark Begley. And then, overlapping it a little bit, this is an incredibly famous painting. Now, it's known as Melting Clocks, but it is called The Persistence of Memory by Spanish surrealist painter Salvador Dali. And there is so much about space in this painting. Now, first, there's the illusion of three-dimensional space, right? These objects on this table appear close to us, then the table recedes back farther away, and then you can tell that these rocks and this lake are farther off in the distance and the sky even behind that. So there's a great sense of three-dimensional space in this painting. But then there's also a really interesting way to use positive and negative space because the subjects here are the positive space, and really this brown area of the ground becomes the negative space, right? There's a lot of space around these objects. So I think that's really, really cool. It's also an interesting way to use color, right? You have this yellow in the sky that blends into this blue, and then that yellow is used again in the mountains. It's used again on the edge of this pocket watch. The blue that's in the sky is also used again on the face of the watch. Really, really cool. And then also look at the space between the clocks. They make kind of a tight triangle on the left side of the painting. So you've got all of the clocks kind of right over here in this triangle, and then all of this space on the right side is pretty empty. It's a really interesting way to use the composition to draw your eye over to those clocks by placing them fairly tightly together and then leaving this space over on the right. So hopefully you understand the way that space can be used to create a three-dimensional effect, usually by overlapping. Right? We know that this clock is in front of the water because it overlaps it. And we know that this clock is on top of this table because it overlaps it. But then there's also the way to use positive and negative space. So positive space, again, are the objects that we are focusing on, and the negative space is that empty area that surrounds it. So here's what I'd like you to try. In your sketchbook, draw an object and shade in the negative space. So like the examples here, choose any subject that you have at your home or outside that you can actually look at. So don't make it up, right? Whatever you decide to draw, make sure you can actually look at that thing. Don't just guess, don't make it up. Make sure it has an interesting silhouette. Remember, we're not looking at details inside of the subject. So something like this remote would be a bad thing to choose because all the details inside, the silhouette is really, really simple. So try to look for something that is an interesting shape. These chairs both work really well. And like the examples shown here, fill in only the negative space and leave the positive space, that's the object, blank. I hope that you have a better understanding now of how space is used in art. Try this exercise, take a photograph of it, post it to your digital portfolio. And if you have questions, please let me know and enjoy the space.